everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and today I am just delighted to welcome back a favorite and frequent guest. Anthony Guerriero is here. He always has an interesting historical topic to talk about. He's been here in the past to talk about everybody from Thomas Jefferson as a foodie to the great pioneering baseball star Jackie Robinson. And today he's here to talk about election history, a very timely topic. Anthony, welcome and thanks for returning to the morning show. Happy to have you here. Perhaps you could start us off by telling us about what was going on in the election that you're here to talk about today.
Mary, it's always good to be back here. It's always good to see you, and always thank you for the opportunity to come on and talk about one of my passions. As you know, I'm a perpetually frustrated Red Sox fan. So we won't go and pivot. Okay, maybe next year.
You have to be sturdy to be a Red Sox and resilient.
Absolutely. So the cries of and characterizations of political candidates. This one's an adulterer. This one's a liar. This one is cozying up to a European leader and possibly will marry off one of their children. That this person is godless, that if this one gets elected, there's gonna be the blending of the races and lawlessness and so forth and so on. And I'm sorry, you think I'm talking about the election of 2024?
Could be.
I'm actually talking about the election of 1800. And a battle between two kindred spirits, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington's former Secretary of State, and Vice President to President John Adams, the author of the Massachusetts Constitution. And it's really the first election of party politics, the Democrat Republicans or the Jeffersonians and the Federalist represented by John Adams. And it's for a podcaster in 2020 had said, or 2022, it said, this is for the soul of America. What was the political philosophy? So presidential platforms and ideology isn't much different than this time, because this is really the first time. What direction are we going to go in?
Yes, right.
The Jeffersonians were at that time really pro-French. They felt that the French Revolution in its ideology was similar to America's, but then you saw it go off the rails. Jeffersonian philosophy was an agrarian state, less government, so forth and so on, in decentralization, where the Federalists were pro-British and wanted more centralization, encapsulated by the imagery of Hamilton. But, the stuff that we see today in 2024, the vitriol that's really, encapsulated presidential politics for the last 4 elections, unfortunately, isn't something new. Right? So, we're here I'm here to talk about one of my favorite people in American history, in Thomas Jefferson. But you've seen this vitriol before in elections. For those, I grew up in a Democratic Kennedy household because my parents were Kennedy Democrats. The big thing about John F. Kennedy wasn't his youth and inexperience, it was his Catholicism.
Right.
In that he was going to be a puppet for the Pope.
Yeah, that's what people believed at the time.
That, this is the first time that there's going to be a person who could possibly be elected who was going to listen to what came out of the Vatican. And that was a big thing. And Kennedy's answer to that was, I'm the Democratic or the nominee for president who happens to be Catholic. That was his answer. So, and we know that he uncovered that, but that was the first election with debates, televised debates, a great campaign and a lot of money, and the closest popular vote in the history of the presidency up at that time. But 1800 really sets the stage where you have these two kindred spirits, these two founding fathers who are as close as they can be. Benjamin Rush said they were the north and south of the revolutionary spirit, and they went at it.
Yeah.
So, the stuff that's coming today and what you're hearing is troubling, to say the least. But we've heard it before.
Yeah.
Okay? So in 1824, the election between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams. So Andrew Jackson represented the West, right? You have all these things being said about both of them. So John Quincy Adams was a former Secretary of State. He was a minister to Russia. He has all this great lineage, son to the president. Had his ideas about building a national university and a canal system. Well, it went back and forth. You know, and the vitriol against Jackson was that he was a murderer. You know, he was known to be in a few duels and had the bullets in his body to remind people of that. He was a general who was an Indian fighter. The worst thing that happened for him was his attack on his family. That he was born out of wedlock, that he was an adulterer, that he was a drunkard, that he was a murderer. And then it really affected his wife, who, when they got married in 1891, excuse me, her divorce wasn't final. So they said that she was an adulterer. And when they went to D.C., after he wins in 1828, Rachel Jackson, his wife, isn't really well received in Washington and is snubbed, and that really hurt her. And then she eventually dies. I think his second year into the presidency, and he never forgave his opponents for that.
For attacking her.
For attacking her.
The stress and,
Yeah, the stress and being shunned and so forth and so on. And it was just a nasty, nasty race. And then you have the election of 1874, which is 1876, with this Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tyndon. And this is post-Civil War. And Tyndon won the popular vote, but the votes in Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, and Oregon were disputed. Rumor of widespread voter fraud and stuffed ballot boxes. So does that sound remotely familiar?
You know what? A couple of things strike me. One is that oftentimes people think that the existence of social media has made things worse, and has given, and maybe it has in certain ways, in terms of the speed with which rumors and attacks can spread around the world, not just the U.S., but the virulence of the attacks, the nastiness of the rumor mills. It sounds as though this is totally nothing new, that political rhetoric has been, so to speak, a blood sport from the beginning of the Republic. And I think often people don't understand that because, sadly, I think we don't learn enough history. And this is often left out. So it is really sobering in some ways to learn about how deep and far back this type of nasty political rhetoric goes, and the willingness to make up stuff about your opponent. But the other thing that's disturbing about it is that that people do it because it works, that our minds are vulnerable to, famously, if you repeat a lie often enough, and if it's a big enough lie, that actually those are effective strategies to get people to accept your lie as having some credibility.
That's the old adage, right? The bigger the lie, the more people are going to believe it. And Jefferson always said that, he felt more comfortable. He had more faith in the people who didn't read newspapers. Those who read nothing, those who read nothing at all are better than those who read nothing but newspapers.
Interesting.
Right? And this is a guy that utilized the press at that time. To knock Adams. And I think that, I think that today's world, and I know we're going to get into it a little bit, social media has definitely changed the landscape. And the messaging. And then, is there outside influences that are changing that messaging? And that's very dangerous. And back to the election of 1824, it was known as the corrupt bargain because there weren't enough electoral votes. And Henry Clay stepped aside, and then John Quincy Adams becomes president, and Clay becomes the Secretary of State. So across the nation and across the board, there are people, and the Jacksonians are saying, well, wait a minute, how can you do that? You know, your votes are going towards him, and so forth and so on. And then for the election of 1876 between Rutherford Hayes, who was a one-term president, a very good president, it goes to the Supreme Court. I mean, they created the House. I'm sorry, it goes back to the House of Representatives. They create a commission, and Hayes wins the presidency by a vote of 8-7 down party lines. Mm-hmm. But there are agreements to take federal troops out of the former secession states, and that's the formal end of Reconstruction.
Yes.
For better or for worse, because then now that the federal troops are out, and I always tell people who don't understand history, I tell my students, there's always a consequence. Mm-hmm. So now you have this oppressive series of laws that can affect the disenfranchised, primarily the freedmen.
Yes, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So now the Ku Klux Klan are all over the place, and you have oppressive legislative policies, a poll tax, and so forth and so on that carries on for over almost a century.
All the predecessors to Jim Crow.
That's right.
And yeah.
That's right. So I mean, you know, nothing's perfect.
Yeah.
And I think that people, I want to get back to your point about what they know about history and what they don't. I mean, I think it's clear to you and anybody else who's listened to me. I'm a history geek. I love history, and I love American history. I think the big issue is not necessarily a failure to understand history in its place. In this country, it's a failure to understand civics.
Yes, which sadly they stopped teaching.
Right. And I think that, you know, as a child in the 70s and 80s, you know, What is a Bill was on TV on Sunday and Saturday mornings. There was an infusion, because of the bicentennial, of dollars about our role in American history, but we taught civics. And there are a lot of people that you and I probably encounter that feel that their vote doesn't count.
Yeah.
Whatever it might be. And I'm not just talking about presidential elections or local elections. If you sit on a board, or you're part of a little league team, or you're part of a bake sale, and you need to vote for the president, the vice president, the secretary, and treasurer, your vote does count. And that's part of that process. And, you know, in 1800, in this election, the country's only 11 years old.
Yeah.
And this is a brand new idea. And I think I came back, and when I talked about Jefferson, is that every revolutionary government got the Declaration of Independence and said, here, this is what we want. This is what we're going to do. That's the start of it. And it's just, I think that people need to have a better understanding of civics and how government works. I think that really, and I think the people who have said this, the journalists and so forth and so on, I really think that Watergate really did a damage as to what you think government is. That the politician isn't as revered as they could be. Now, you know, this is a story as old as man. We put people on a pedestal. Yeah. And, you know, we're famous to knock them down, but we always like a second act. And Jefferson and Adams definitely have a second act.
Yeah. Well, going back to 1800, Anthony, and Adams and Jefferson, Adams did win. But it was very close.
Yes.
In fact, it was the first time that an election had been punted to the House of Representatives.
That's correct.
So tell us a little bit about how that worked, and how many ballots it took.
Yeah, so, I mean, this was worse than the election of 2000, right? Gore and Bush, where they had to wait 4 days, and the Chads and so forth and so on. No one knew what was going to happen. It was very frustrating. Jefferson didn't know, and Jefferson retired to Monticello thinking that, you know, McCullough and John Meacham, for his great book, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, and then in Adams, Jefferson just retreated to Monticello, and he's like, you know, I've given all that I can give. You know, if they don't want me, they don't want me. Jefferson, who still was vice president under John Adams during the stalemate, and it took 36 ballots, did go to Adams, asking him to intervene, and Adams declined. He says, Adams firmly believed in separation of powers, and that this is in the House of Representatives, that they have to resolve the issue. The other problem here are the characters involved. So it's not just John Adams. It's Alexander Hamilton, who's really the de facto head of the Federalist, a Washingtonian. George Washington's number one, versus the James Madisons, the James Monroes, and the Thomas Jeffersons of the Democrat Republicans. And you have Aaron Burr from New York, who was running with Jefferson as vice president, but, the things that they said about Burr are just as bad as they say about each other. Unsavory, manipulative, just was going to grab power, and ended up tying Jefferson for the same amount of electoral votes. So you would think that I'm running for vice president, I'm going to demur to Jefferson, I'm just going to step back, and I'm going to call Mary Jacobsen, who represents Upper East Side of New York, throw your electoral vote to Jefferson. He didn't do that. And I don't know who would, right? If you're that close to power, who would do that? It's very tantalizing. And, and if you read everything, Hamilton looked at it and said the lesser of the two evils is Jefferson. He didn't like Jefferson, right? And they were both in the Washington camp. He was Secretary of the Treasury, brilliant man. We all know about his story because of the great play, right? In the musical. Didn't really care for John Adams, and reminded John Adams that he only won the presidency by 3 votes, and you might be the picture-head of the Federalist Party, but you really have no power. It's the rest of us. And he was, and Adams' chief mistake, and Jefferson reminded him of that, was that he kept Washington's cabinet. He never put in his own people, and that was a problem. Because they weren't loyal to Adams, they were loyal to Hamilton and Jefferson. But Jefferson thought that, and I think I have it somewhere, Jefferson felt that, Hamilton felt that out of the two of them, Burr would be the worst choice. That Jefferson believed in institutions, believed that things would remain the same, and that Jefferson was the better choice of the two. So that says something that that Hamilton for example, I'm reading from the book Mudslinger's 25 Dirtiest Political Campaigns of All Time by Kerwin Swint.
Oh, that's
Hamilton's plan for a national government to assume the country's debts and start a system of national banks threatened to build a foundation of national control of the states. To Jefferson, the Federalist game plan would destroy the constitutional balance of power. So, that's what what they felt. And Hamilton believed Burr to be an unprincipled scoundrel, and said that Burr would employ the rogues of all parties to overrule the good men of all parties. I trust the Federalists will not finally be so mad as to vote for Burr.
A scoundrel.
A scoundrel.
It's just very modern-sounding rhetoric.
Right.
But it's also very historic rhetoric.
And we know how that argument ended.
Yeah, because Jefferson won. So.
Right, Jefferson won, but Burr and Hamilton ended up having a duel. And it was a culmination of things. It wasn't just about this particular item. But, and there's always the debate that, Hamilton shot at a branch, and did Burr really have any intention of killing Hamilton? And then his intention was probably to shoot over his head, and then he just mortally wounded him, and that was the end of his career. So it gets tossed, and then Jefferson comes out on top. But the key here is, so it goes to the House, and it takes 36 ballots, and then with Hamilton's influence, Jefferson is the winner. But the thing here is that you need to look at the relationship between Hamilton and Adams
Mm-hmm.
that starts with the Continental Congress.
Mm.
Like I said earlier, Benjamin Rush always believed that they were the North and South. When Virginia and
Mhm.
Massachusetts were leading the
Mhm.
revolutionary train, let's
Uh-huh.
say, to move forward. And the committee to write the Declaration of Independence was Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson.
Yeah.
And this is what Adams, and it's interesting, right? Because Adams, self-realization. Adams says this, right? He presented to Jefferson the reasons why the delegate from Monticello should draft the document. Okay, so this, because,
Mhm.
Adams was very famous. He acquitted the troops from the Boston Massacre. Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business.
Mm.
Reason second, I am, this is Adams saying about himself, obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular.
Some self-awareness.
That's great self-awareness, and I think that, I think, and this it represents, a typical, when you think of a Massachusetts politician,
Uh-huh.
cranky, rock solid, salt air influenced politician, and it's just interesting. And he admired him. And Jefferson, when he was writing the Declaration of Independence, was under great stress.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was dying, and both he and Adams. So there's so many connections there.
Yeah.
So they're both at the they work on the Declaration of Independence.
Mhm.
They're at the revolutionary moment. Adams is pleading for support during this time when Boston's invaded by the British. They're both foreign ministers. Jefferson, who we know as a ladies' man, met Abigail Adams and was intrigued by her, and she of him.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have John Adams and Jefferson sharing having all these intellectual discussions, but intellectual sensibilities. But their lives were marred by tragedy.
Yeah.
They both lost children very young. They both lost their wives, Jefferson a lot earlier than John and Abigail. And so there's that similarity.
Mm-hmm.
And then really towards the end, they recognized that they were the last of that revolutionary spirit. And they were so linked, and then there was concern, and I thought that the John Adams series that you and I were talking about from HBO did a really good job of showing that.
Yeah, it was excellent.
Jefferson was the minister of France, and then his ideas on revolution changed, and that's where the rift started. And even Abigail had said to him, he goes, Thomas has changed. And then, Jefferson was a Francophile, but then the revolution changed, and that revolution became bloody.
Yeah.
And then you have a fight really between two brothers, and it was nasty.
And Anthony, because they had shared so many profound experiences together, and then there was this nasty 1800 election, and Jefferson wins, and what impact did that have on their relationship? Did it sour them or embitter them about one another?
Yeah, I think that, there were a lot of things. John Adams was in an impossible situation. He was following the legend.
Yes,
Right.
still does.
Still does.
Yeah.
And he even recognized himself during his lifetime that, he's going to be forgotten. It's going to be, Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. And that was the case really until 30 years ago with McCulloch, or if he lived in Quincy. During Adams' presidency, you had issues with the British and French. And Adams did not want to go to war. He wanted to stay peaceful. I just said that he had issues within his own cabinet, which alienated both Hamilton and Jefferson because he didn't change his advisors. He kept Washington's advisors. And usually when you're an elected official, you have a right to change that, but he didn't do that. He was very stubborn and self-righteous. the Alien and Sedition Acts, which we would see over 100 years later under Wolfson, challenged the right to speak up against policies you felt unfair, and that offended a lot of people, particularly Jefferson.
Yeah.
Who wrote the Virginia Resolutions and wrote the Declaration of Independence and said, this is contrary to the revolutionary spirit for which we fought.
Yeah.
And then you have the XYZ affair and the taking of money. So this really sullied a lot of things with Adams. There was the belief that Adams wanted to be a monarch. And King John Adams, particularly because John Quincy was really rising up the ranks. And then the nastiness. I mean, there was a guy, a writer named James Callender, who Jefferson employed through other resources to write disparaging remarks about Adams and the Federalists. And then when he went to jail under the Alien Sedition Act, he turned his back on Jefferson. And then when Jefferson was president, it was really the first time they talked about him having a black concubine, which that became that. Yeah, it did hurt. It hurt Jefferson. It hurt Adams a lot. Because I think there was a couple of things where he and Abigail both loved Jefferson. That the things that he tried to do were going to be forgotten. And then Jefferson, who believed in small government, purchased the Louisiana Territory. Yeah. So, I mean, and the man who wrote that all men are created equal is the only and we talked about this, the only founding father that didn't free his slaves upon his deathbed, which it's difficult to fathom. And they didn't talk for a long time. And then he goes back to Braintree to become a farmer. Jefferson has he's elected a second time. He has an 8-year term, 2 terms. Very successful president. Considered the top 5. J. Adams not even in the discussion. And life takes its toll on both of them. Neither Adams or Abigail appreciated the fact that there were these rumors about Jefferson having children with a slave and then knocking Jefferson. But if you went back in that time, if you went back to 1800 and took a straw poll in that county, I mean, that was well known. It was a secret, but it was well known that slave owners,
the way of such things.
Slave owners and their offspring had these relationships. And they didn't talk for a long time, and it wasn't really until Abigail passed away that they talked. Abigail did send a letter out to Jefferson upon the death of one of his daughters because she was friendly with him and remembered her. She also lost her daughter too, Abby Jr. And he wrote to him. He says, I want to let you know about the passing of Abigail. And Jefferson, if I can find it, does respond to him. And it's just, he just talks about being tested, being tested by life. And, that he believed that we would see them again. And that started the friendship because, they had said, well, who do you want to, who should we notify about the death of Abigail? And they said, what about Jefferson? And they said that you have to be the first one. It's Jefferson's not going to write you. You need to write him. And Adams was, hurt by him. He said, Mr. Jefferson did me a great wrong. And, it's just,
and these
it's
kind
unfortunate.
Of hurts endure. But
they sure do.
it's such an extraordinary and fascinating relationship with so many twists and turns that are also at the heart of American history.
Yes.
Anthony, and we were talking, and the culmination of that relationship is also extraordinary because I think they were both 90, if I remember correctly, when they died, and they died on the same day.
Yes.
Which is just, I find it very touching. And when that HBO show about John Adams deals with the end of both of them, it's very moving because it feels like some kind of historic link between them. Destiny is the word I'm looking for.
That's right.
It feels like they shared a destiny in starting our new republic. And I remember one of the scenes from that show that has stuck with me forever is near the beginning. And it shows Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney, playing John and Abigail. And they're standing on a hillside outside of Boston. And they're looking down, and it's still very rural looking because Boston is not what it is today.
That's right.
And they're gazing out, and they're both talking very thoughtfully, saying, "Oh, I wonder if we'll have a country someday." And it just makes you realize history is contingent upon so many things and upon the individual people who make it their purpose in life to start a revolution, to start a democracy of all things, to devote themselves to the rule of law and to egalitarianism.
Yeah.
And so it was an extraordinary kind of moment. For me anyway, it had a big impact. I think about it often. And it's just such an extraordinary end to the relationship between these two men that they left the planet.
On the same day.
They left the nation at the same time.
July 4th, 1826.
Yeah.
And Jefferson had died early in the morning. I mean, there was no internet, right?
Right.
So, Adams was coming in and out of consciousness, is hearing the cannons because it's a celebration of the 4th. He knew it was the 4th. Possibly had visions of Abigail and others in the room. Mm-hmm. But his last words, according to those present, was, "Thomas Jefferson lives."
Yeah.
So on his deathbed, he's not reaching out for Abigail or his father or anybody else. His thoughts revert back to Jefferson.
Jefferson.
And Jefferson had probably died about 9 to 8 hours earlier. He didn't know that. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing, and to your point regarding history, every man, because they were men, that signed that Declaration of Independence, that was a treasonous act.
Mm-hmm. They took a risk.
Major risk.
Yep.
And the British and the spies were in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
And any time that John Adams got out to get a pint, could have been captured and hung for treason.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson, who made the trek back to his home in Monticello, British soldiers could have been there waiting for him.
Yeah.
And he did have to evacuate Virginia when he was a wartime governor. Mm-hmm. And I think people don't understand that. And it's such an interesting period because we've had great moments in history, and we've had great leaders, right? And we've seen, you can't debate what FDR did during the Great Depression, right?
Yeah.
So forth and so on. But that group of men and what they were able to establish, because they were students of history.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Primarily they were students of history. Mm-hmm. They had classical educations. A lot of them were lawyers. Jefferson and Adams are both lawyers. Understood how government worked, and didn't like what they saw, particularly what Adams had to deal with in Massachusetts. And he had a great supporter in Franklin. Who was the Brad Pitt of his time in Europe, which is a different story for another time, which is amazing to me. They loved it. We'll have to come back and talk about that.
I've never heard anyone make that comparison.
We'll have to talk about that.
Explore that later.
But you had these men that, look at Washington. Yeah. Washington was a military man in the British Army and fought in the French and Indian War. Yeah. As a colonial soldier for the British. Yeah. And amazing. it was really like, a jump shot.
Yeah.
That we're going to create this government, of the people, for the people. It had never been done before.
Yeah. We
know the framework from different types of governments, and let's give it a shot.
Yeah.
And there's so many similarities between the two. And, Jefferson was definitely eccentric. Adams was a little bit more crusty. Jefferson would open up the door at the White House in his slippers and his pajamas and his bathrobe. Adams was more formal, and it just they're linked forever.
Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
an interesting thing that the fact that they died on the same day really, because if you go to the Adams homestead, there's a bust of Jefferson, and if you go to Monticello in the dining area, up on the wall is a bust of Adams.
The link continues. It's eternal.
Yeah.
So, Anthony, I have to ask you then, so if those two men were running against one another today, what do you think? Who would win?
That's a great question. Because the society we live in today, because of John F. Kennedy, was such a virtual society in what we see.
Yes.
Jefferson is definitely the better looking and better dressed one. I mean, Adams would have to really do something with his hair and maybe get on the keto diet. I think it'd be hot. I think in today's world, because of social media, in the questions about fact checking, I think Jefferson would have a tough time.
Interesting.
I think there'll be people who will say that. I think that the first thing is, I think that what you see, I think that the Alien Sedition Act would definitely generate a huge outcry, and I think the college students would rally against that, similar to what we've seen in the last 12 months, or what they did, college students did fighting Vietnam.
Right.
So I think that you would see a lot of that, because it's putting pressure on the press, no freedom of speech, and then deportation.
Yeah.
I think that Jefferson would have a very difficult time trying to explain his relationship with Sally Hemings.
Yes.
His poor business dealings. There are rumors that he swindled people out of money, that he wasn't a good lawyer. So I think the social media would affect both of them in a negative light. I think it would really do a job on Jefferson.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a close race. In this case, I don't know. I had to flip a coin, because, if you have a person that's passing the Alien Sedition Act and is saying that you cannot criticize the president for actions that he or she might take, you're going to run again? You're going to run this person again? But then you have a person that wants to disarm. Jefferson basically, when he became president, he stopped the building of the Navy. Which at the end of it, after his presidency, we have the War of 1812. Good thing Adams built the Navy, because the US's Constitution was built under Adams.
Yeah.
And then so you have a guy that is saying all these things, is looking at the rural vote, not much different than 2016 in that election, but I just think that his indiscretions might come back to haunt them. But we've seen other candidates who've had indiscretions survive, and those who didn't survive.
Yeah.
Gary Hart from 1988.
It seems so quaint from today's perspective.
Yes, Gary Hart was the leading candidate
Yep.
to be the Democratic nominee, and then he had that issue with monkey business. I think Donna Rice was the woman.
Yes. What? Yes.
And that killed his campaign.
Yeah.
And then we've seen it with Clinton and Trump and others.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if there's an acceptance, because then what would have happened if you had social media during the Kennedy election? And we've known what's happened, his life.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about what they claim as extramarital affairs, his health.
That's right.
And the same thing with Roosevelt.
Yes, that's
FDR,
Yep.
There's a great documentary, as always, by PBS on FDR, and there's only like 3 seconds of film that show FDR how he manipulates his legs and walks. And when he gave speeches, his car would drive up. They would create a platform where his car would drive up. He'd get out, and his son was on. He'd hold on to his son's arm. His son would build up his arm with weights, so it was strong. FDR would move his legs, sway them back and forth. He had heavy braces. So there was talk late in the 1920s, when he ran for governor of New York and then when he ran for president, how sick was he?
Yeah.
He presented to the American public, he was clean of polio.
Mm-hmm.
And if you take a look at the imagery in the posters of him, you know, he's healthy, he's strong, he's a superman.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, he wasn't, you know, as healthy. So if he was running for president and they had social media back then,
Yeah.
you know, how can you have
Yeah.
a cripple in the
And that's the
presidency?
word they would have used.
And that's the word they would have
Absolutely.
used.
Right.
I mean, today might be a little bit different. I think they'd
Right.
still attack that individual.
Right.
But if we're going to 1932,
Right. Different attitudes.
you know, it's a different attitude. We don't know enough about the disease. Is he very
Right.
cured? You know, he's an older man. Is he going to survive?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Because that's an issue that will be exploited whenever it can be exploited. Well, Anthony, I want to find out before we end today a couple things. I want to ask you. You're always working on something, so I want to find out what you're working on now. But before that, we've been talking about presidents, and you're very knowledgeable about them. What president or two top your list of the best of the bunch?
Thank you for asking me that. You know, I had great parents, and my mother was a teacher, a lifelong teacher. My mother was a Kennedy Democrat. This, you know, was part of that generation.
Yeah, my mom was too.
Graduated college in '61, the first one in the family. So she was wrapped up in that, similar to how I was wrapped up in it when I graduated college. So I knew a lot about John F. Kennedy. Through my years of teaching, I taught a course on the American presidency at Salem State for many years, a very popular course. You know, when I was growing up, I was a Washington fan as a kid because Washington was a revolutionary hero and all that. As I've gotten older, I've appreciated Lincoln a lot more, and I've influenced my son, who is my 10-year-old son, can come here and talk to you about Lincoln. I mean, he's a big Lincoln fan. The presidents that I like Teddy Roosevelt. Because he's lived an interesting life. Speak softly, carry a big stick, and he put government to action.
Yeah.
I love food. Thank God for the Pure Food and Drug Act passed by Roosevelt that made sure that there were standards for food. You know, and he had his challenges. Grew up with childhood asthma.
Yeah.
Lost his wife and mother on the same day, which is
so
horrific.
Tragic. Yeah.
But he utilized the national park system. Lincoln's really the first one to create the national park system with Yellowstone. But, you know, he expanded it. I think that FDR would be on my top list because he saved democracy.
He did, yeah.
You know, if you take a look at the presidential election of 32, there was probably the closest time we came to becoming a non-democratic country, maybe a socialist or communist country, because capitalism wasn't working. And we were the shining star of capitalism, and we're in this Great Depression that started in 29, and there was no solution. Private sector and the public sector were not coming up with a plan. And Roosevelt did. And he had, in his first 100 days, if you take a look at that legislation, and I do a talk on the CCC, which I think we talked about.
We did, yes.
The Civilian Conservation Corps, which is great and employed all these men that ended up being the foundation for the Army in World War II. I think time is too close to discuss Clinton and Obama and George Bush and George Bush Sr. What I like about Kennedy is that he learned from his mistake. So he was sold a bill of goods on the Bay of Pigs, which was an utter disaster. And he took that learning experience and applied that to dealing with the Cuban Missile Crisis in the famous 13 days in getting all these opinions. He wasn't rushed to judgment. And he knew, he understood, and I think his brother Robert did too, he understood the stakes greater than anybody, that if we attack, this is the end of civilization. So I think that as a student of history and a student government, what I like about Kennedy was there's that learning curve. You know, and I know
So
he gets.
important,
It's
yeah.
so important. I know he gets pegged with Vietnam, which had started under his predecessor. So we don't know how far he would have went,
Yeah.
and naturally, his successor Johnson expanded
Yeah.
that. But you know, I like that. But if I would have to say that it would be my top three is the two Roosevelts and Jefferson. I just
Yeah.
find Jefferson so fascinating. And I thought they were very, very good presidents. And there have been a lot of good presidents. I mean, if you take a look at what even Nixon did during his presidency.
He did some surprising
He
things.
did some
He
very
opened
surprising
China.
things. I mean, EPA,
Yeah.
the foreign policy.
He was in favor of a guaranteed income.
That's right.
Things that would just be slammed today as, you know, communist.
And the
But he had that idea, and
his insecurities were his insecurities
they were his
was
downfall.
his downfall.
Yeah.
And you take a look at, you know, even Ulysses S. Grant was a decent president, even though
Yeah.
he was loyal to a fault and there was corruption.
Yeah.
But in Lincoln, I mean, Lincoln, by the time he ran for president in 1864 re-election, there wasn't a guarantee he was going to win.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he wasn't a well-liked president.
Yeah.
And think of everything that he did. So
You know,
they're interesting. They're interesting characters.
and there was a lot of talent there, as you're pointing out, and a lot of important accomplishments, but no person, and therefore no president, is perfect. So they all have their flaws and their scandals, and there's always a temptation to corruption, even if not in yourself, the people who follow you. But it's inspiring to review some of the noble things that different presidents have brought to us.
That's right.
And important to keep that in mind, not in a put them on a pedestal way, because I think, and I know you agree, you have to keep the humanity of somebody in focus, because it helps us understand who we are and it helps us make better choices.
That's right.
So, Anthony, thank you so much for that. One final question, if I may, because it's always fascinating to talk to you, and it's always fun to think about what you might be working on next. So I know you're working on something. What is it?
So I've been toying around with two subjects, actually. One would be the Great American Songbook.
Wonderful.
Now, my father was born during the Great Depression, and you know, when I was growing up, it was a lot of big band music
Yeah.
in the standards, particularly Sinatra and Bing
My
Crosby
dad loved those.
and the
Yeah.
Mills Brothers. So when I was growing up, there was a lot of that music,
Yeah.
and the music is just—it's so well written.
It is. It's witty.
It's so well written.
beautiful, it's
Cole
lyrical.
Porter and
Yeah.
all those people, and the different interpretations are fascinating. And you know, Ella Fitzgerald didn't want to do some of these songs, which is amazing. And then she was convinced, and that really her profile went up.
Yeah.
And then take a look at the singers, even modern pop singers, like Linda Ronstadt, who did a Dynamite album in the '80s on that. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm also thinking about, which is something new. My son and I have been watching silent film comedies of Chaplin, Keaton, and Lloyd, and it's just interesting.
Yeah.
And there's the Fatty Arbuckle component to it too, which Keaton and Chaplin were understudies to, and their films are very good, and they're very witty, and I think that might be an interesting thing, only because like I'm a movie fan.
Yeah.
And silent films have gone the way of the dodo bird.
Sadly, they have.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Some of these films are really good.
They're brilliant.
You know, and I'm
Absolutely.
only really watching the comedies. I haven't
Yeah.
watched anything else. And the comedies are funny. They're slapstick,
Yeah.
but they're entertaining.
Yeah.
And you know, those four guys and Fatty Arbuckle, Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Lloyd, Harold Lloyd, it's just interesting because then. They didn't make the change successfully into talkies.
Talkies, yeah.
Right? I mean, Chaplin made
Yeah.
some good films.
Yeah.
Buster Keaton did have a third act later in life, but Lloyd just, you know, it just didn't translate into the spoken form. But, you know, you've seen Abbott and Costello and Laurel and Hardy, and the Three Stooges owe a lot to them. And that comedy isn't dissimilar. So I like that, but I think the music is timeless.
It is, absolutely.
And there's so many great songs.
So many wonderful songs. And they're such brilliant songs that they lend themselves to new interpretations
That's
by
right.
new generations of singers. So, well, okay, you're going to have to come back then.
Thank you, Mary. I look forward to that.
Consider yourself pre-invited.
Sounds great.
Anthony, I can't thank you enough. It's just been fascinating. You have a way of making history come alive.
Thank you.
And I just love learning from you and with you. And I'd say the theme for presidential elections is, I don't speak French, so I'll mangle this, but le plus ça change, le plus la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's exactly right.
The technology may change.
That's right.
But the underlying kind of methodology tends to remain the same because people are the same.
That's right.
So thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you, Mary.
I really appreciate it. It's so much fun. I've learned a lot. You take care now.
You too.
Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Until then, everybody, please be well.